Hello and welcome to Psychological Insights. Today's topic is gun violence. Now, you're probably wondering why Psychological Insights is tackling this topic. We're speaking to Dr. Robert Ham. He's a psychologist in West Hartford Center, and I guess he's going to tell us why. I'm Pat Kazikoff. Stay with me. So, Dr. Ham, why are we talking about gun violence?
Isn't this a topic of great concern today in our society, and for good reason? There's been more violence and killings because of guns or related to guns than ever before. Here in the United States, just last year, there were 49,000 gun-related deaths.
So how has the Supreme Court and the law of the land, how have they contributed to this phenomenon, if indeed they have?
Yeah, I don't know if everyone would agree with that appraisal of the situation, but they certainly have been involved, and they should, because our Constitution grants its citizens the right to bear firearms. But the controversy is over what is meant. Of course, reading the Constitution is like reading the Bible or the Torah. It's all, interpretation. What did our founding fathers mean when they established the Second Amendment?
Before you go on, you just reminded me of something that I found very, very relevant. You mentioned the figure 49,000 deaths
Right.
this year in 2021. Give that figure some context for me. Is that a lot? Is that a little? After all, we have over 300 million people in the country. So give me some context for the 49,000.
Yeah, the numbers have been going up in recent years. I think in 2020, it was about 45,500, something like that. So these are record numbers, and they seem to be probably escalating in the past few years. Why that is, we're not sure. But one of the theories is that more than ever, guns are accessible and they're promoted by manufacturers. And so this is why there's such a debate. Now, not all, the shootings that get sensationalized, of course, are the mass shootings. And those are very infrequent, relatively speaking. Not that they're not important and they're not of great concern. But most deaths due by gun are due to suicide, which constitutes about 2/3 of gun-related deaths, and homicide, and that usually involves domestic violence.
But I'm noticing that in 2020 or 2021, you had 611 mass shootings, which is practically 2 a day. That sounds to me like a relevant figure, 2 a day. It makes America look like it's gun happy.
Yeah, that is our reputation throughout the world. Unfortunately, the mass shootings also have increased significantly. They've been keeping data on that since the year 2014, and the numbers have been below 400 until just a few years ago. And it seems that it coincides the year 2020 when the numbers shot up, pardon the expression, that coincided with the onset of the pandemic. So yeah, this year, the Washington Post back in June published an article that said so far this year, until then, there have been about 300. So we're on track for about the same number this year.
Well, I'm not happy to hear that we're on track, but what exactly is, I mean, you mentioned, and I mentioned also that we have a reputation of being gun happy. What is I don't know if I can ask it, but what is the US ranking compared to the world? Like, where are we on that continuum regarding these kind of statistics?
Well, that's somewhat controversial. It depends, statistics, the meaning of statistics is partly determined by who's interpreting them, and how you interpret them. And that's the downside of statistics. So they can easily be manipulated or in terms of how we interpret them for our own purposes. So if you take the mean or the average over several years, the United States ranks about 11. But if you take the median, which is a different measure of central tendency based on percentiles rather than actual numbers, and you take it on a year-by-year basis, which reflects more not the number of deaths due to mass shootings, but how many mass shootings there are. The United States ranks #1.
Well, I would think that in this particular situation, the median is a more relevant figure than the average for this particular situation. I mean, if we are #1 in the world as far as the median is concerned, that would make us gun happy compared to other countries that are in civil war, civil strife. How did we get to be #1? I mean, we shouldn't be #1.
No, this is one case where you don't want to be #1. That's right. Yeah, the median, I think, is a better reflection of how many mass shootings there are taking place. Now, the formal people have different definitions about what is a mass shooting, but most, I think, scientists agree on the criterion of four or more people who are injured or killed other than the assailant. But the median is a good barometer of how many of these mass shootings. Whereas, someone could have a higher mean if there's just one mass shooting, but a lot of people were killed, there was a mass shooting where 69 people were killed in Norway several years ago, and that shot up the numbers. But there's very few mass shootings in that country.
So the other thing that you hear about when you talk about gun violence is the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. How does this translate to our American society?
Well, I mean, again, the Constitution was designed to make this, to render a government that was not subject to tyranny. The founding fathers were, they came from the British Empire and all of that, as we know from high school history. And so one of the Bills of Rights that they formulated to give people greater freedom and power in relation to government was to grant people the right to bear arms. But again, it's all in the interpretation. How do we interpret the Second Amendment? Is it a right that is granted to individuals? And some court cases, especially recently, have been slanted in that direction. Or is it a right that is more literally, in black and white in the Second Amendment, pertains to a militia?
So what's the prevailing thought nowadays? Because I do recall when the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan took place quite a few years ago, and the Brady Bill was introduced. The interpretation changed.
Well, that wasn't a court case. That was legislation, the Brady Bill, and. So that event precipitated legislation to make it harder for people to buy guns. You had to now go through a sort of a background check, and there had to be a waiting period. Now that no longer pertains because we have computers, so that information is much more accessible. But the history of the Supreme Court's involvement, which the judicial branch has to do with the interpretation of the Constitution, has shown that there seems to be a trend from an interpretation that interprets this amendment as having to do with a collective right towards, in the past 20 years or so, since the 21st century, starting with the Heller case in 2008, more of an individual right.
So that's a trend, this movement to individual rights. Am I correct?
Well, I think that trend reflects the change in the members of our Supreme Court, that, as we all know. I mean, Donald Trump, our last Republican president, as you know, he appointed 3 judges. And even before then, since the Earl Warren court back in the 1960s, the court has been gradually shifting towards the right. And now we know it's roughly 6-3. So that, the court's rulings on the Second Amendment reflect that shifting in the constituents of the Supreme Court.
But things keep changing. I mean, with the Buffalo shooting most recently, I understand that Governor Kathy Hochul, she put through quite a bit of legislation that is designed to change this concept of individual rights.
Yes, I mean, right after, and that was just this year, wasn't it? New York State legislature quickly passed that law, that bill rather. So there are, I mean, every state has its own guidelines and statutes, even though the Supreme Court has been weighing in on cases brought to the Supreme Court where suits, there are lawsuits petitioning for greater individual rights, but states still have latitude.
Well, so what about bringing it more local? What about Connecticut? How does Connecticut differ? I mean, we're here in Connecticut, so how do we differ in our legislation towards gun violence or bearing arms?
Yeah, well, Connecticut does have a law where it's fairly strict, relatively speaking, where you do have to have a permit to carry a handgun. And also, Connecticut is one of only 8 states, I believe, that do grant law enforcement the right to take your firearm from you if they find reason. And I know I had a patient once where this was the case, where he was the subject of a domestic dispute. Law enforcement was involved. He had firearms in the house, and they took his firearms for a period of a year. So that's unusual. Connecticut has more, I think, stricter gun control statutes than most states.
I know this is an opinion, but it seems to me that there should be one policy for the entire United States on this topic. But indeed, you're saying that each state is separate in its laws on this particular topic. Doesn't it seem to you that we should have laws that govern all the states for this topic, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, this is another one of the big debates that we are dealing with in this country, isn't it? I mean, when the Constitution was written, it granted states a lot of, the Articles of Confederation before our Constitution. That was our first Constitution. Didn't work so well because it granted states so much power that they went off on their own and threatened the Union. So the Constitution that was formulated after that, 1787 or so, but did give the federal government greater power. But still, states, as we know, and this is, is so current in our political struggles in this country, still have a lot of power independent of the federal government. And this is still debated, as we know, like abortion rights. States do have a lot of power and leverage and these kinds of, and many issues. It's just, we're the United States. We're not just a federation.
No, I mean, this is based on history. This is a historical fact, and I guess that's how we came that we have this power over this particular, over gun violence. But I want to bring it a little bit more local, because I think that people are interested in the more local issue. What is the profile of the typical mass shooter?
I think that it's been very difficult for scientists to sort of nail down and predict who is likely to be involved in these kinds of awful, heinous events. But I think that some of the stereotypes do ring true in terms of the trends that we look in, but I should say with that, with the caveat that we shouldn't overgeneralize in stereotyping. But we do note that many of these are, in fact, all are men, unfortunately.
Well, that makes some sort of statement, doesn't it?
Yes. But they tend to be white, male, and young. The personality profile is a loner, or someone who is sort of alienated from his peers or from society. Someone who has an axe to grind, is disaffected. So there is an article that I thought was very insightful by the journalist David Brooks in the New York Times in July of this year, which I think really helped, to address some of the controversy, because I think many on the political far right on this issue of gun control have been trying to, and unfortunately, it almost vilifies mental illness, point a finger at people with mental illness. And I think that really does a disservice to people with mental disorders, but also it oversimplifies. So in David Brooks's article, he opines, and I agree, that many of these shooters, these mass shooters, although they have mental health issues, obviously, they are not necessarily identifiable or classifiable as having a mental disorder per se, either because they haven't been in the mental health system, or they don't necessarily fit our classification system per se. Rather, I think Brooks's article addresses that this is the problem from a sociological perspective, that this is a phenomenon that is partly a function of our sort of religious embrace of the right to bear arms. And I think that our society, which is now fragmented today, and our sense of community isn't as strong as it once was. So a lot of people fall through the cracks, and we live in the age of computers and social media that only amplifies, whether it's elections or whatever issues that people wish to air their grievances on social media. And then you add to that how the National Rifle Association has become very politicized, I mean, it used to be more of a guild kind of an organization that was whose purpose was to promote good gun safety, sensible use of guns. Now has become politicized, and the manufacturing industries have also devolved in salacious advertising, appealing to young men, their masculinity and sexual prowess, and their the Uvalde shooter, for example, where he bought his gun, the retailer, I think, had been using, advertising using very salacious kinds of advertising, appealing to machismo. And this appeals to young men especially who are disaffected, feeling emasculated or ostracized by their peers, trying to establish their identity and their sense of self-esteem. Very misdirected in doing so.
I can understand all those generalizations, but what I'm hearing in all those generalizations is how difficult it would be to really identify someone before the actual act. This idea of mental illness. I mean, what exactly is mental illness if it's not identifiable? If it doesn't have a diagnosis, then what do you do with this information? And after all, there's a ton of people who are disaffected, but it's a very small minority who commits mass shootings. So you have a dilemma here in trying to identify people before indeed the act is done. So
absolutely.
So what do you do? Like, how do you prevent these mass shootings? What is the answer?
Right, that's a very good point, Pat. I totally agree with you. It's almost impossible to predict violence. All you can do is you can identify risk factors. But because violence, especially mass shootings, the consequences are so great that it certainly behooves us as a society to address this issue in a preventative way. So I think that we, as a society, our communities, our school systems, and they are doing things to try to identify risk factors when they see them. When we see these events, there was an incident not long ago where a young man had, what was it? I think it was Wisconsin, I think, and his parents are also being brought to trial as guilty because the school system brought them to school because they saw the signs. So the schools are doing, many of them, and if they aren't, they should be, to identify the risk factors. Individuals who appear depressed, if they see things that on the part of students that are warning signs that they may be susceptible either on social media or drawings and writings, to develop school programs, anti-bullying programs, counseling services, alternatives to violence as a means of conflict resolution, self-esteem building, and in our communities to provide support services for families that would also help families at risk, where these children often fall through the cracks. That's what we have to do.
What I'm hearing from you is that it's not that difficult to identify risk factors, but it is very difficult to predict violence. And all the things that you're suggesting, what I'm hearing is that the schools, you're putting a lot of onus on the schools because that's where you identify these risk factors. But the schools are doing what you're talking about. They are teaching self-esteem. In fact, people are sometimes saying that it's too much self-esteem and not enough math and English. There's that dilemma. But what I'm also hearing is that although we have these sort of systems in place, we really don't have an institutionalized way of not just identifying the risk factors, but doing something with the risk factors. Calling the parents into a school for a school meeting is not enough. there has to be something beyond that, because schools call the parents in for meetings for many, many things, and that's where it ends. So there has to be a step afterwards. What are you thinking?
Well, you do have to have, services to address these problems, as I'm saying. And yes, some people complain that we're the me generation, too much self-esteem building, but I think nonetheless, there's a lot of, especially young people today, who suffer from low self-esteem. So even though we complain that the millennials are the me generation, nonetheless, this still is a big problem. But what you're talking about now, I think, Pat, is not something that's easily addressed because now we're dealing with the fabric of society itself. So, some people say that there's not enough mental health services. I agree. There's a dearth of them. We need more support, financial support, to promote mental health services for the general population and make it more accessible and affordable. We also need to make changes in our society. So that's very broad, isn't it? What are we going to do about social media? We've had a TV show on that topic, right? And the fact that our society right now here in the United States is so fragmented and there's so much alienation. There are cultural wars that are going on, and economic pressures. There's no middle class anymore. So these are, very systemic. Racism and misogyny. These are systemic problems that are not easy. They should be addressed, but I don't have any easy solutions. I think that the manufacturers, for example, the retailers, maybe there should be some breaks on advertising, as it is with cigarettes and alcohol. There recently, the International Organization of Standards in Switzerland recently established a policy or a plan, I should say, to identify with the code purchases for guns so that they can be traceable. So people who are purchasing and selling firearms are more easily identified. I think it takes a community.
Or as they say, it takes a village.
It takes a village.
might take a village.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But I'm hearing that it's a complex issue, and I'm hearing that it's not easy. You've been in practice for so many years, and if you're saying that the self-esteem of young people has plummeted, that's what you're seeing. It's a systemic problem. It's not going to be solved overnight, and you're competing with so many other problems. You're, like you said at the beginning, you're competing with climate control, with abortion rights. You're competing with disease. I hate to end the show on a downward note, but give me something positive to end it with, and that's what we'll end it with, Dr. Ham.
Well, I think that one of the problems that we are dealing with now, I feel, this is just my opinion, is that there has been a lack of compassion in our society. Part of the narcissism and me generation that's been growing over many decades. And I think we are now, the chickens have come home to roost, if you will. So there does need to be, and I see, this year, some legislation has been passed, our infrastructure bill, to invest in what's positive, to build farm resources in the United
Then that's what we're going to end with. We're going to end with what's positive, because otherwise we can talk about this for millennia.
So stay tuned.
Yeah, so
that's right. The elections.
Right. So thank you very much, Dr. Ham. Always interesting and always educating. And thank you for educating me and for educating the West Hartford public. And we'll see you next month. Thank you again.
Thank you.